Fog rolls low over the hollows of Virginia that winter, thick as wool, heavy enough to hide the world beneath it. It was the last week of December, 1891, when the sheriff's men arrived at the Talbot farm just after sunrise. Their breath rose like smoke as they worked, shovels breaking the crust of frozen red soil. Lanterns swung from tree limbs, throwing patches of gold against the white mist. Every strike of metal against earth echoed through the valley like a slow heartbeat. The sheriff, Elias Granger, stood a few feet back, his coat collar turned high against the cold. He had seen plenty in his 20 years wearing a badge, but what they unearthed that morning would follow him to his grave. By noon, the men had found 4 graves. By sunset, they had found 13. Each was shallow, just deep enough to hide a body, never deep enough to forget one. The victims were buried facing west, their palms turned upward as though they were waiting to receive something. When the last grave was opened, a deputy fell to his knees and whispered, "Lord have mercy, they've got no eyes." Granger pulled back the tarp from the nearest corpse. The face beneath was pale and drawn, the eyelids sealed neatly shut, the sockets underneath clean, surgical, deliberate. There was no blood, no sign of violence, only a cold, unnatural stillness. He turned toward the farmhouse that stood at the edge of the clearing, the old Talbot home, 2 stories tall with a sagging porch and frost-glazed windows. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. The people of Hollow Creek had long whispered about the Talbot sisters, Margaret, Ada, and Ruth, 3 women who lived alone on the edge of town, women the church called strange, and the men called trouble. Now, with the graves stretching behind their home, they were the only names that mattered. But the sisters themselves were gone, vanished, without footprints, without trace. As dusk thickened, the fog rose higher, swallowing the trees and the farmhouse together. One of the deputies murmured, "Feels like the earth's breathing." Sheriff Granger didn't answer. He was staring at the dark line of the creek beyond the field, a narrow ribbon of water that twisted through the woods like something alive. He had been told by locals that you could hear voices there at night, carried on the wind. He'd always dismissed it, but that evening, even with men and lanterns nearby, he swore he could hear faint singing from beyond the trees. The sheriff ordered everyone to halt the day. "We'll continue come daylight," he said. But daylight didn't make Hollow Creek feel any safer. Now, before we go further into this story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I always like to know who's out there in the dark with me. Hollow Creek, Virginia was the kind of place that time forgot. A handful of farms, a small wooden church, a mill that hadn't run since the war. Most folks there lived quiet, simple lives. But isolation does something to people. It grows its own kind of faith, and its own kind of fear. In 1891, there was no telegraph line that reached the valley. The railroad passed 40 miles to the north. What news came by mule cart or not at all. And so when strange things happened, when livestock went missing, when a family vanished, when the creek began to run brown after a storm, it stayed inside Hollow Creek. Secrets never left the hills. That winter had been colder than any on record. The ground froze solid in November and never thawed. The trees cracked under the weight of ice. People kept close to their hearths and kept their doors locked at night. The Talbot sisters had lived at the far end of the old road, a mile past the mill, their house tucked deep between pines and thicket. No one remembered the last time they came into town. Some said they brewed medicine. Others said it wasn't medicine at all. When Sheriff Granger reached their property that morning, he found the gate wide open, the lock broken clean. A trail of disturbed soil led behind the barn. The air smelled faintly of iron. Inside the house, everything was left as if someone had simply stood up and walked away mid-meal. Plates still set, a kettle left on the stove, and 3 chairs drawn close to the fire. On the mantel above the hearth sat a single item, a framed photograph. It was old, maybe 10 years by the look of it, a faded sepia portrait taken by a traveling photographer from Roanoke. 3 women standing shoulder to shoulder in black dresses. The eldest, Margaret, stared straight into the camera, her face half lit by the photographer's flash. Ada, the middle sister, looked downward, hands clasped in front of her as though in prayer. Ruth, the youngest, turned slightly away, her eyes unfocused. What drew the sheriff's attention wasn't their expressions. It was the background. Behind them, barely visible through the blur, was the same field where they were standing now, the same crooked tree, the same earth that was now being turned over by his men. He held the photo up to the light and whispered, "How many are out there?" Word spread quickly through Hollow Creek that night. Lanterns burned in every window. People gathered in the church, praying louder than they had in years. They didn't ask who the victims were. They asked what had been buried. The sheriff sent a rider to the next county, asking for help from Richmond. But before a single officer could arrive, the Talbot house went dark. By morning it was empty. The sisters were gone. Their tracks ended at the creek. The water ran still, black as oil. And from that day on, no one in Hollow Creek would walk that road after sundown, because they said the ground there still moved sometimes, like it was breathing, and when the wind passed through the valley just right, you could still hear them sing. They say Hollow Creek was a place the railroad never wanted. A valley too steep, too quiet, and too far from anything worth connecting to. The hills kept it secret, folded deep in their arms like something they meant to hide. Travelers heading west would pass the ridge above and never know there was a town below. If they did, they wouldn't stop. From a distance, Hollow Creek looked peaceful, cabins scattered through the trees, smoke curling from chimneys, the creek cutting silver through the valley floor. But locals used to say that peace was only a trick of the light. "The land here, don't forget," an old farmer once said. "It just waits." People who grew up there didn't trust outsiders, and outsiders never stayed long enough to understand why. Livestock would turn up dead without a mark. Tools left in the field would vanish overnight. Lanterns sometimes flickered in the woods where no road went. And always when the fog rolled in from the creek, it carried sounds, low, rhythmic murmurs that rose and fell like breath. The locals called it the creek that whispers back. If you stood by the water long enough, it would seem to answer you. Children dared each other to call their names across it, but most never tried twice. They said the creek didn't echo, it replied. The soil there was rich, but strange, thick with clay that stayed damp even in August. The air carried the scent of moss and iron. Trees grew twisted, their roots pushing up through the ground like bones. On clear mornings, mist pooled so low you could walk through it like smoke. It wasn't a place built for sunlight. Hollow Creek's people were mountain folk, tough, quiet, and private. They raised corn, kept pigs, brewed moonshine to sell across county lines. The church bell was the only sound that carried far. It rang every Sunday at 9, and again at noon if there'd been a death. There was no doctor, only a midwife who lived miles out near the ridge. A woman named Agnes Talbot. Folklore said Agnes had been different. Born in 1790, she worked as a midwife and healer. But she'd been accused of witchcraft in 1813, after a miner's wife died during childbirth. The trial never happened. A fire destroyed the courthouse before she could stand before the judge. Some said that was coincidence. Others said it was payment. After that, the Talbot name became a thing whispered, not spoken. Agnes died in that same valley, and her children carried on quietly, farming, trapping, and keeping to themselves. The generations that followed stayed just as private. It was her bloodline that led to Margaret, Ada, and Ruth Talbot. Nearly 80 years later, the three women who'd live and die in the same valley their ancestor refused to leave. By the late 1800s, Hollow Creek was a ghost of its former self. The Civil War had taken its men. The mines to the west had taken the rest. Only about 40 families remained. And in small places like that, stories became law. Some nights the fog would roll in so thick you couldn't see the next fence post. You could hear the water moving, slow and cold, but not see it. It was in that kind of fog, folks said, that things happened. A cow would wander off and never return. A man walking home from the mill would lose his way and be found the next morning standing waist-deep in the creek, staring at nothing. Old-timers said you could tell when the land was angry. The ground would hum like it had a pulse. Chickens wouldn't lay, dogs refused to bark, and the air would smell like something burning far away, even when there wasn't a fire for miles. The people of Hollow Creek learned to take such things as part of living there, the same way they accepted hard winters and poor harvests. You didn't question the land, You respected. You stayed home after dark. You kept your fire burning, and you didn't go near the creek when the mist began to rise. If anyone was foolish enough to ask why, the old folks would tell the same story passed down from their grandparents. It went like this. Once, long before any of us, the land here was promised. Someone took what wasn't theirs, and the ground's been hungry ever since. No one could say who made the promise, or what was taken. But the warnings. Every few years someone went missing near the water, and the town stopped looking sooner each time. By 1880, the disappearances were just another thing that happened in Hollow Creek. A traveling merchant gone. A farmhand vanished between barns. Sometimes a stranger from another county, their wagon found, but not their body. People started to say it was the price that the land chose, and always the whispers came back to the same family, the Talbots. They had lived there longer than anyone. Their garden always bloomed, even when others failed. Their livestock never sickened. Their lanterns never went out, no matter how long the storm lasted. Yet no one could prove they'd done wrong. They went to church on Easter, paid their dues at the mill, and helped bury neighbors when the time came. They were polite, they were quiet, but behind closed doors folks spoke differently. They know things, people would murmur in the general store, things they shouldn't. And by the time Margaret, Ada, and Ruth Talbot inherited that land, the stories had already grown roots. Stories of their great-grandmother who could call the wind, who could stop a child's crying just by touching its forehead, who could heal or curse with the same. Most chalked it up to superstition. But superstition has a way of surviving where the railroad won't go. When someone disappeared near the Talbot property, no one knocked on their door. When a traveler asked directions through Hollow Creek, folks told them, don't take the creek road, because everyone knew, once the fog rose from that water, it didn't care who you were. The land was cold, wet, and always watching. And in Hollow Creek, that was enough. If you'd asked anyone in Hollow Creek what kind of people the Talbot sisters were, you'd get a different answer depending on the hour and who was doing the talking. By daylight, they were useful. By nightfall, they were feared. The eldest, Margaret Talbot, was 34 when the sheriff's men dug up the graves behind her home. She'd been the steady one, the voice of reason among the three. Folks said Margaret could read a man's mind by how he held his hands. She wasn't cruel, but she didn't waste words either. When their father died, she took over the farm, ran the accounts, and made sure no one cheated them at market. Sharp as a hat pin, old Mr. Bales used to say, she had a way of looking at you that made you straighten your posture and tell the truth, even when you didn't mean to. Ada, the middle sister, was different. She had a softness to her that didn't fit Hollow Creek. Her hair was always loose, her hands delicate, her eyes far away, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice had a strange calm to it, the kind that made people forget their own thoughts. But Ada was best known for her singing. She sang in the church choir when she was young, before people started avoiding the pew beside her. Her voice wasn't loud or fancy, just clear and haunting, the kind that clung to your bones. Children would stop their play if they heard her across the valley. Men working their fields sometimes claimed to hear it in the wind, long after she'd stopped singing. And then there was the youngest, Ruth. Ruth was 22 and nothing like her sisters. She had her father's temper and her mother's dark eyes. Where Margaret worked and Ada prayed, Ruth wandered. She'd vanish into the woods for hours, returning with mud on her dress and scratches on her arms. She talked to the creek like it might answer her. People saw her walking the banks at night, barefooted, hair unbound. Someone once asked her what she was doing out there alone, and she smiled, a sharp, knowing smile, and said, listen. The Talbot family had once been like any other. A father, mother, and 3 daughters living off the land. Their father, Thomas Talbot, had fought for the Confederacy and came home quiet, never the same. He drank hard, worked harder, and died in 1886 from what the coroner called exhaustion and fever. His wife, Eliza, followed him 3 months later. The doctor said it was the same illness, though some whispered she'd simply lost the will to live. Others said Margaret found her mother cold one morning, sitting upright by the window, a Bible open in her lap, and that the page she'd been reading was blank. After that, the sisters withdrew from town life entirely. They stopped attending church. They sold the last of their livestock and began trading herbs, tonics and handmade tinctures to those desperate enough to knock on their door. Margaret learned midwifery from a traveling nurse, and soon women from as far as Bristol would come to her for childbirth or illness. Etta treated coughs and fevers with teas made from plants no one else recognized. Ruth hunted, fished, and roamed. The people of Hollow Creek learned to rely on them and to fear what reliance meant. Because the Talbot sisters didn't charge money for their work, they asked for other things. A photograph, a button, a lock of hair. Sometimes just a handful of dirt from the patient's yard. Most folks thought it was harmless superstition, mountain tradition, but every now and then someone and those who refused always seemed to lose something soon after. A crop would fail, a baby would be born sick, a husband wouldn't wake up one morning. No one ever accused the sisters directly. Not out loud. In a place like Hollow Creek, words like witch or curse were dangerous things to speak. Still, the stories spread. A farmer claimed Margaret once warned him, "You'll want to fix that fence before Friday." He didn't, and Friday morning his best mule was found broken in the same spot. A girl from the church swore Ada predicted her engagement 2 weeks before the proposal, describing the ring exactly. And Ruth didn't need stories. People saw her standing on the creek's edge, whispering into the mist, her reflection rippling like it was trying to pull her under. The sisters lived alone, but they weren't lonely. They seemed content in their solitude, like they belonged more to the hills than to the people who lived among them. Children would sometimes wander near their fence line, just to see if the stories were true. Some said they heard music from inside the house, low, mournful hymns, sung in harmony. Others said they saw lights moving through the windows at night, not candlelight, but something cold. No one ever caught them doing wrong. No one ever found a reason to call the sheriff. But the unease never left. Even those they helped would speak their gratitude in whispers. Old Miss Porter, who'd once been delivered from a fever by Ada herself, said it best years later. They were kind enough girls, but when they looked at you, it felt like they already knew how your story ended. People began to avoid them out of habit. Conversations would stop when one of the sisters entered the store. The preacher prayed louder on Sundays, though he never said for what. Yet when sickness came, when a birth went wrong, when someone vanished, and the menfolk had no explanation, they still called for the Talbot. Because in Hollow Creek, help was help, no matter what it cost. And each time, the sisters answered. Margaret would arrive with her leather satchel. Ada would hum under her breath as she mixed herbs and oil. Ruth would linger by the doorway, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, toward the woods, toward the creek, toward something else entirely. Afterward, they'd leave quietly, and people would recover. Or they would, but no one ever forgot how still the room felt when they walked out, as if some invisible wind followed them. In a town where gossip was currency, the Talbots became rich. Their reputation grew until no one could separate fact from story. To some they were angels of mercy, to others, something darker wearing mercy's face. But everyone agreed on one thing, as one old man told a reporter years later. They were polite, sure, always were, but something in their eyes made you want to cross the street. Spring came late to Hollow Creek in 1887. The frost lingered longer than usual, clinging to the pine needles and rooftops, as if the season itself hesitated to wake that year. When it finally did, it brought with it the first disappearance. The man's name was Caleb Morton, a farmhand from the Eastern Ridge, the kind of fellow folks described as harmless, which in Hollow Creek meant simple, hard-working, and usually half-drunk come Saturday night. He'd been seen that evening at Harlan's Tavern, laughing too loud and boasting that he'd been invited to call on the Talbot sisters. Some said he'd been dared, others said he'd been hired to deliver a sack of feed. Whatever the truth, Caleb left the tavern just before sundown, whistling, his horse trotting west toward the Fogged Valley. He was never seen again. 2 mornings later, his horse turned up by the creek, grazing near the bend where the mist never lifted. Its reins were torn, its saddle dark and soaked, not with rain but with creek water, heavy with the smell of iron and silt. At first folks thought he'd fallen in and drowned, but the creek wasn't deep enough for that, not unless you walked straight into its heart and didn't. Sheriff Griggs organized a search. For 3 days, men and lanterns scoured the woods, calling Caleb's name through the fog. They found boot prints leading down toward the water, deep, deliberate, but none leading back out. No body, no hat, no footprints beyond the creek's edge. When the sheriff finally came calling at the Talbot house, Margaret answered the door. She stood calm, hands folded, her dark dress spotless despite the mud that clung to the steps outside. Griggs asked if Caleb had stopped by that night. Margaret said, "No, Sheriff, we haven't seen him." And that was all she said. Her sisters were somewhere behind her in the shadows. The sheriff claimed later he saw Ada standing by the window, her face pale, her lips moving as if she were humming to herself. But when he looked again, she was gone. No one pushed the matter further. In Hollow Creek, you didn't accuse the Talbot women unless you were ready to face what followed. For a time, Caleb's disappearance became the talk of every porch and church pew. Folks speculated, blamed the drink, or the wild hogs, or the river current. But as the weeks passed, the talk quieted, because Hollow Creek had a way of swallowing its own noise. Then that summer, it happened again. A traveling salesman never made it past the Ridge Road. His cart was found overturned, his mule gone, his wares scattered and wet as if a sudden flood had rolled through. But there'd been no rain for days. A peddler's wife swore she heard singing one night by the creek. A woman's voice, soft and slow. She followed the sound for a while before realizing she'd wandered too close to the Talbot land. When she turned back, the singing stopped, and the woods went silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, weighted. By autumn, a preacher's son failed to return from a hunting trip near the same creek bend. He was young, barely 16. His rifle was found resting neatly against a tree, as if set down with care. His footprints ended at the water's edge, same as Caleb. Each time, the story repeated. The prince led in, but never back. People began to whisper again about the Talbot family curse, that the land itself had turned hungry, taking what it pleased. Margaret, Ada, and Ruth carried on as before, their routines unchanged. They still sold their tinctures, still tended the sick. Margaret still came into town for supplies, quiet and polite as ever. But now, even polite felt like a warning. Children would stop their games when she passed. Grown men found reasons to cross to the other side of the road. And yet, no one dared speak blame aloud, because every soul in Hollow Creek had needed the sisters once, or would again. Then came the boy's story. He was 10, maybe 11, lived with his grandmother near the mill. Late one evening, he'd been sent to fetch water before dark, and he swore he saw something rise from the creek. Not a log, not an animal, a hand. He said it was pale, dripping, fingers curling like it was reaching for something, he ran home screaming, dropped the bucket, wouldn't go near water for weeks. His grandmother beat him for lying, but the story spread faster than she could hush it. A hand rising from the creek. Some said it was Caleb, some said it was the preacher's boy, some said it was something older, something that didn't care about names. The sheriff rode out again, half to ease the townsfolk, and half because he couldn't sleep. Right after hearing the boy's story, he searched the banks, found nothing but animal tracks and the faint smell of rot under the moss. He never went back after dark. By the first frost, people stopped going near the Talbot place altogether. Even the mail riders cut a new path that looped around the hollow, though it took them twice as long. No one said the sisters were guilty. Not out loud, but Hollow Creek grew quieter that winter. Fewer voices in the tavern, fewer sermons in the church. Even the creek itself seemed to hush, like it was listening. Fear had rooted itself deep in the soil, and the strange thing about fear in a small town is that it doesn't fade, it becomes part of the rhythm, something you live beside, learn to ignore and never fully forget. That spring, another man disappeared, then another, and before long, the people of Hollow Creek stopped keeping count. They just learned not to look too hard. Because in Hollow Creek, once the creek took something, it never gave it back. By the winter of 1888, the people of Hollow Creek no longer spoke the Talbot name unless they had to. It was as if their tongues refused to shape the syllables, like saying it out loud might summon attention from something that listened too closely. But silence, in a town that small, doesn't kill rumor. It feeds it. The first to break that silence was Reverend Claiborne, during his Sunday sermon. The church was packed that morning, the air heavy with wood smoke and fear. Claiborne stood at the pulpit, voice shaking, Bible open to Exodus. He didn't say their names, but everyone knew who he meant when he warned of women who turned from God's light to make covenant with the dark. He spoke of temptation, of unnatural gifts, of those who heal with one hand and take with the other. He told his congregation that God's mercy had a limit and that the hollow had run past it. That was the day mothers began forbidding their children from crossing the creek, not even to fetch kindling, not even by daylight. The Talbot sisters' cabin stood 3 miles down a dirt road that twisted through fog and pine. Nobody went near it anymore, not even the desperate or the drunk. But at night, the stories still traveled. A boy swore he'd seen candles burning in the sisters' windows, well past midnight, 3 flames flickering in perfect rhythm, as though the light itself were keeping time with something unseen. An old trapper claimed he'd heard voices coming from the creek, soft and harmonic. Not words, not songs he recognized, just a sound that didn't belong to any living creature. He said it was 3 voices, all the same, all perfect. And when he followed the sound, the air grew so cold that his breath froze against his beard, though it was midsummer. By spring, livestock began turning up dead near the property line. Calves, chickens, even a hunting dog. Their bodies weren't torn or eaten, just drained like the life had been pulled clean out of them. The sheriff tried to dismiss it as disease. Folks wanted to believe him, but deep down they knew better. Hollow Creek had seen disease before. This was different. Men began walking with rifles again. Lanterns burned later at night. The church bell tolled more often, though not always for services. And then there was the merchant's story. He was a man named Edwin Pruitt, a traveling seller who passed through the valley twice a year, bringing salt, sugar, and fabric. One evening, he was camping near the old sawmill when he heard something drifting from the water, faint, almost like wind. At first, he thought it was frogs or crickets. Then the sound took shape. 3 voices, women's voices, singing. He told the sheriff later it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard, soft, unearthly, in perfect harmony. It drew him closer without him realizing. He said he found himself standing knee-deep in the water before he understood where his feet had taken him. Then he saw the reflection, not his own, but 3 figures standing where the creek met the fog. He couldn't see their faces, only their outlines, still as statues. The next morning when he reached town, his hair had gone shock white. He sold what little he had left, packed his wagon, and never came back to Hollow Creek again. After that, even the boldest men stopped walking alone after dusk. By then, the town's fear had begun to shift. It wasn't just the sisters they feared. It was the idea that the hollow itself had turned against them. The mill pond froze early that year. Wells ran dry without reason. Chickens refused to lay. People whispered that the ground had gone sour. In the general store, men sat in silence, listening for something beyond the crackle of the stove. At the tavern, nobody told jokes anymore, and when someone went missing, the search parties got smaller each time. It was as though the whole valley had come under a spell of watchfulness, that quiet, tight feeling that you're being counted. The preacher told people to pray harder, but prayers felt lighter than the fog, and just as easily lost. There were nights when a dog would bark and then fall silent, and every house on the ridge would wake at once. Candles would light behind curtains, shadows would shift, but no one dared open their doors, because opening the door meant seeing, and seeing meant being seen. By now, the sisters rarely appeared in town. Margaret came once that summer for salt and lye. The shopkeeper's wife remembered her eyes, how calm they were, how she didn't blink much. Ada and Ruth stayed home. Folks said they heard laughter drifting from the hollow on certain nights. Not cruel laughter, just strange, like something remembering joy long after it had forgotten what it meant. No one went to confront them, not even the sheriff. By autumn, the church pews were half empty. Some families moved west. Others locked their doors before sundown and waited out the nights in silence. The Reverend tried one last sermon, about Job and how faith must endure through darkness. But halfway through, a wind rattled the church windows so violently that every candle went out. He didn't finish that sermon. He never spoke of it again. From that night on, even the righteous kept quiet. And through it all, the sisters' cabin stayed lit. A pale, flickering glow through the trees like a heartbeat under the earth. The town had begun to unravel. Faith, reason, law, all of it slipping like silk through water. What took their place was something older than either, a quiet understanding that whatever haunted Hollow Creek had eyes, and it was still counting. By the winter of 1891, Hollow Creek had reached its breaking point. More than a dozen people were missing now, hunters, travelers, children, and though no one said it aloud, every whispered name seemed to drift toward one place: the Talbot farm. That was the year Sheriff Elias Granger took the badge. He wasn't from Hollow Creek. Granger had fought for the Union 30 years before, seen the worst of men in the war, and carried the kind of silence that only soldiers bring home. He was known to be fair, slow to anger, but when he decided something was wrong, he moved. And when a farmer named Ben Lowry came into town pale and trembling, claiming he'd found something buried near the Talbot fence line, Granger knew it was time. Lowry said he'd been hunting for lost sheep when he noticed a patch of soil that looked too fresh for winter. When he scraped at it with his boot, he swore he smelled rot, old, wet, and human. Granger gathered 4 deputies that same night, lanterns, shovels, rifles. The air was bitter cold, moonless. The fog pressed low to the ground like breath on glass. They reached the Talbot property just past midnight. The farmhouse stood still in the dark, every window black, chimney smoking faintly. A dog barked far off, then went quiet. Granger ordered 2 men to check the barn, 2 to circle behind. He went straight to the fence line where Lowry had pointed him earlier. The soil there was darker, looser, like it had been turned not days ago, but hours. He knelt, pressed his glove into the dirt. It came up damp and sticky. When they began to dig, the smell hit first, sweet and heavy, like meat gone bad. A few feet down, the lantern light caught a scrap of fabric, pale blue cotton, the kind used for Sunday dresses. Then something worse. A hand, small and shriveled, fingers curled toward the palm. The men dropped their shovels. One vomited in the brush. Granger just stared. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "We keep digging." Before the night was through, they uncovered 3 bodies, all women, all facing west. Each had been buried shallow, their eyes missing. Granger covered them with canvas, jaw tight. "We're not done here," he said. At first light, we searched the house. The barn was empty except for a mule that wouldn't stop pacing. The deputies said they found jars along the rafters, glass sealed with black wax, filled with things that looked like herbs, and things that didn't. By the time they stepped onto the farmhouse porch, even the bravest of them hesitated. The front door was unlatched. Inside, the air was warm, the hearth still glowing, a kettle steaming faintly on the coals. It smelled of sage and iron. Granger called out, "Miss Talbot?" No answer. He stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his boot. The walls were lined with herbs and dried roots, hundreds of them. Animal bones hung from the ceiling on twine, rattling softly as the door shut behind them. In the parlor, a Bible sat open on the table. The pages were blank. One of the deputies found carvings on the support beams, symbols, circles, lines intersecting like a map. No one could read. Another lifted a jar from the mantel, its wax seal stamped with something like a handprint. They moved through each room, sparse beds, glass jars, wooden chests. Then they reached the staircase. Halfway up, they noticed the wall markings grew darker, deeper, carved with knives. At the top was a locked door. Granger tried the handle. It didn't budge. He ordered it forced. The deputy brought his boot down twice. The lock splintered. The door swung open to reveal a small room, lit only by a single candle stub. On the floor sat 3 chairs arranged in a circle. In front of them, 3 clay bowls, each filled with something dark and dry. On the wall behind, painted in what looked like ash, was a symbol that none of them could name. The candle flickered. The flame bent as if something had moved past it. But the room was empty. No sign of the sisters. No footprints. No coats missing from the rack. It was as if they'd walked out the door only moments before and vanished into the fog. Granger stepped to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened until the barn disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, water was running. The creek, louder than usual. He turned back to the men and said, "We dig at dawn." That was the last order he gave that night. They sealed the house and rode back to town in silence. When they reached the station, One deputy swore he heard something behind them, a sound like humming, faint and low. Granger didn't turn around. He just said, "Don't look back. If you're still here, you're one of the few who can handle stories this dark. Let me know in the comments." With an emoji, the earth felt heavy underfoot, like the ground itself didn't want to be disturbed again. Granger stood at the edge of the porch, eyes on the field beyond the fence line. He didn't know it yet, but what they were about to uncover wouldn't just end the search, it would rewrite the story of Hollow Creek itself. Dawn came gray and hollow over the Talbot property. Not sunrise so much as the night thinning into another color of dark. The fog still clung to the ground, thick enough that Sheriff Granger's men could barely see one another's faces as they set their shovels in the soil. The frost crackled underfoot, and every breath hung like smoke. By mid-morning, the first body was unearthed, then the second, then the third. By noon, they'd counted 13 graves, all shallow, all within 50 yards of the house. The pattern seemed deliberate, like someone had chosen the spots carefully. Every corpse was laid facing west, hands folded across the chest, palms turned upward. Their skin was gray, the flesh still strangely preserved beneath the clay, as though the cold earth had been keeping them. Each skull had been opened with precision, the eyes removed cleanly, no sign of struggle or tearing. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. One deputy muttered that it looked surgical. Another crossed himself and refused to dig further. By afternoon, the fog began to lift just enough to show the outlines of the ridge, and the house standing watch over the field like something that had been waiting. Sheriff Granger stood at the edge of the dig, jaw tight, coat collar pulled up against the wind. He didn't speak much, only took notes and drew small marks in his ledger. But his hands trembled each time another body surfaced. Among the dead were men and women, even a child, no more than 8 years old, still wearing a shoe with a broken buckle. When they lifted her from the soil, the ground beneath was colder than ice. Granger knelt and pressed his glove into it. The chill went through the leather, biting into his bones. "This ground's been dead longer than it should be," he said quietly, like the cold's coming from underneath. No one replied. They worked in silence the rest of the day. Every few hours, another shape would come up. Another lost traveler, another neighbor gone missing. Each grave seemed fresher than the last, though no one could explain why. Around dusk, Granger ordered a sweep of the cellar. The entrance was hidden beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, sealed with iron nails and a length of twine smeared in wax. When they pried it open, the smell that rose was worse than anything above ground. A damp, metallic odor that clung to their throats. Lantern lights spilled down a narrow staircase into the dark. The cellar was small, lined with shelves of glass jars and bundles of earth. Most of the jars were empty, but a few still held murky liquid that glimmered faintly in the light. Floating inside were things that looked too much like organs to name. On the far shelf stood a row of small bottles, each labeled carefully with dates and initials. There were 13 bottles, each one filled with clear water. Granger lifted the nearest and held it to the lantern. The tag read, "C.M., March 1887. Every missing name had a bottle to match. The sheriff placed them one by one into a canvas sack, his breath shallow. "Whatever this is," he muttered, "it's record-keeping." In the corner of the cellar, under a sheet of burlap, they found a burned ledger. The pages blackened, the ink melted into gray streaks. Only one line was legible, scrawled near the top of a half-burned page. "The water takes what it's owed." Granger read it aloud. The room went still. He looked at his men, pale, sweating despite the cold. "Pack it up," he said. "We're done here for tonight." One deputy asked, "Sheriff, what do we tell the town?" Granger didn't answer. He climbed the cellar steps without looking back, the burned ledger tucked under his arm. Outside, the sun had already dropped behind the ridge. The fog returned thicker than before, curling low along the graves. The air had gone so cold that the lantern flames burned blue. The sheriff sent a telegraph to Richmond, requesting investigators, a coroner, anyone who could make sense of what they'd found. He signed it with shaking hands. The message went through, but no reply ever came. By nightfall, they'd set up camp near the edge of the property. A small fire, a ring of cold men who refused to look toward the house. No one spoke much. They ate in silence, the only sound the slow bubbling of creek water somewhere in the dark. One deputy said he saw movement near the tree line. 3 shapes, faint and still. But when he blinked, they were gone. Another said he heard humming. Granger told them to get some rest. But he didn't sleep. He stood by the graves until the fire burned low, eyes on the house. Listen, every so often, the wind would shift, and he thought he could hear voices, low, steady, overlapping in strange harmony. He told himself it was the sound of the creek, but deep down he knew the difference. That night, as the fog swallowed the last of the firelight, the sheriff made a promise to himself. Whatever had happened in Hollow Creek, whatever had turned those sisters from midwives into monsters, he would bring it to light, even if it meant digging until the earth itself started whispering back. The fog came back that night, thicker, heavier, and colder than before. It rolled off the creek like breath from something sleeping beneath it, spreading low across the Talbot property until the graves themselves vanished under a pale, shifting veil. The men kept their posts, lanterns glowing faint orange against the gray. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the sigh of wind through pine, seemed magnified as if the hollow itself were listening. Sheriff Elias Granger stayed awake at the fire's edge, coat drawn close, rifle laid across his knees. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. Each time he blinked, he thought he saw movement in the mist, shapes that dissolved when he looked straight at them. Around midnight, Deputy Mercer called out from the west perimeter. "Sheriff, you see that?" Granger rose, boots sinking into the wet grass. "See what?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He just pointed toward the creek where the fog was thickest. There, across the dark water, 3 figures stood side by side, unmoving, their outlines faint but unmistakably human. Women in long dresses, hair trailing loose in the wind. Granger's breath caught. "Lanterns up," he said softly. 4 men lifted their light. The glow stretched across the water, weak and trembling. The figures didn't move. The fog curled around them, thickening until their faces disappeared. And then, one by one, the lanterns began to die. First Mercer's, then Hafford. Then the fire itself seemed to shrink, sputtering as if the air had thinned. "Keep the flame steady," Granger barked, but it was no use. The last light went out, swallowed by the fog. In the dark, the only sound was the faint trickle of the creek. Then, something else. A humming. Low at first, almost gentle, like a lullaby sung through water. It wove through the trees, 3 voices rising and falling in perfect harmony. Granger shouted for his men to regroup, but the sound swallowed his voice. He reached for the lantern, struck a match. The flame flickered weakly, lighting only his own face. The fog pulsed almost as if breathing. Then silence. He called the roll. No answer from Mercer. No answer from Hafford. By dawn, 2 deputies were gone. Their bedrolls were untouched. Their rifles still leaned against the fence. The sheriff followed the trail toward the creek, his boots crunching over frost and dead leaves. When he reached the bank, he stopped cold. There, pressed into the wet mud, were footprints, small, bare, and soaked through. They led straight from the water toward the Talbot house. He followed them carefully, revolver in hand. The prints were perfect at first. Every toe, every arch clear, but halfway across the yard, they simply stopped. No scuff marks, no sign of turning back. Just gone. Granger's breath came in clouds. He looked up at the house, its windows black, its roof sagging, its door hanging slightly open as though waiting for him. He stepped inside. The hearth was cold now, the air damp and sour. The boards creaked beneath his boots, each sound echoing like it didn't belong in the living world. He moved through the parlor, past the shelf of broken jars, up the stairs that groaned under his weight. Every step carried that same wrong chill, the kind that sinks into the bones and makes the body remember death. At the end of the hall stood the locked door they'd found before, only this time, it wasn't locked. The latch hung loose, as though something had slipped through from the other side. Granger pushed it open. The smell hit first, water, but not clean water, the kind that sits too long in darkness, thick with silt and rot. The floorboards glistened under the gray morning light. A shallow pool spread across the room, cold and perfectly still, as if the creek itself had seeped through the foundation. Around it, set evenly in a circle, stood 7 mirrors, tall, freestanding, old enough that their silver had begun to fade. Each mirror was turned inward, reflecting the water, reflecting each other, creating endless, dizzying tunnels of glass. When Granger stepped closer, the reflections rippled, though the air was still, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw faces in them. Not his own, not human, exactly, pale, half-submerged faces, with eyes that moved independent of the mirror's angles. He blinked, and they were gone. Near the center of the pool lay a small object, half-floating, half-submerged. A photograph. He fished it out carefully, water dripping from its edges. It showed 3 women standing before the Talbot house. Faces stern, dresses plain. The same photo that once hung by the hearth downstairs, but this one had been altered. Each face was scratched out, gouged with something sharp. Across the bottom, in faint pencil, was written, "They came through for us. We will return the favor." The sheriff stared at the photo, then back at the mirrors which seemed to darken as the morning light grew stronger. He took one step back, and the water in the center shifted, not like ripples, like something moving beneath. He froze, heart pounding, every muscle locked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then faintly, from somewhere deep below the floor, came that same humming, soft, distant, almost kind. Granger stumbled backward, nearly falling into the hall. He slammed the door and braced it shut, his breath ragged. Downstairs, the fog was spilling through the cracks in the windows, seeping into the rooms like a living thing. The graves outside were gone from view, erased by the mist. He knew then the sisters hadn't run. They hadn't fled the law or the town's wrath. Whatever they'd been doing in that room, with their jars and their prayers and their water rituals, it wasn't meant to end in death. It was meant to continue. He stepped out onto the porch, the wind cutting through him, the creek's song barely audible under the whisper of the fog. He whispered, almost to himself, voice shaking in the cold air, and from the direction of the creek, faint, carried on the wind, came the soft, perfect harmony of 3 voices singing. For a while, Hollow Creek tried to pretend things could return to normal. The sheriff's men were buried quietly behind the church, their graves marked only with plain stones. The official record listed them as lost to the elements during investigation. No mention of the cistern, no mention of what was found. But the town had already begun to empty. Families packed wagons before sunrise and left before anyone could ask why. Mothers whispered to their children not to look toward the Talbot property when passing by. By winter's end, the schoolhouse had closed, the mill went silent, and the church stood boarded up, its bell rusting, its steeple leaning like a broken finger pointing nowhere. They said Hollow Creek was cursed. Others said it was simply tired. Sheriff Elias Granger lasted another 6 months. He stopped attending town meetings. He stopped shaving, stopped sleeping in his own home. Neighbors found him, some nights, standing barefoot at the edge of the creek, muttering things no one could understand. Once, a passing farmer swore he heard the sheriff whispering 3 names over and over again, though he wouldn't repeat them afterward. When spring came, Granger turned in his badge. He left a single note on his desk. The water doesn't forget. Weeks later, a hunter found him wandering near the old Talbot Road, clothes soaked, eyes unfocused, mumbling to someone unseen. He never recovered. They say he spent the rest of his days in a sanatorium outside Roanoke, speaking only when it rained. The townsfolk, what few remained, decided to do what should have been done years before. They gathered one night with kerosene, torches, and fear disguised as courage. A line of men marched up the Talbot Road, faces lit by trembling firelight. The house waited for them, black windows reflecting the flames like eyes that had been waiting to open. They said a prayer first. Then they set it alight. The flames took to the grass, the barn, the fences, burning fast and bright, but when they reached the house, they faltered. The fire wouldn't catch. They poured more oil, threw more torches, shouted curses into the smoke, but the flames curved away, as if the air itself bent to protect those walls. And then came the rain, a sudden, heavy downpour, but only over the field. Not a drop fell on the rest of Hollow Creek. The fire died out, steam rising from the soaked earth. When dawn came, the barn was ash, the fences gone, yet the Talbot house stood untouched. Damp, dark, watching. After that, no one tried again. The road grew over, the fields went wide, and in time, even the name Talbot stopped being spoken aloud. By the turn of the century, Hollow Creek had vanished from maps altogether. Travelers passed the valley without realizing it was there. A few families settled nearby in later years, but none stayed long. The wells always tasted faintly metallic, and livestock refused to drink from the creek. Old-timers in nearby towns would still lower their voices when the weather turned. They'd say, "Don't speak their names after dark." They'd say, "The creek listens." And sometimes, late at night, the wind through the hollows carried what sounded like singing, three voices in harmony, drifting through the trees. Decades later, long after the last house had fallen in on itself, a group of hikers followed an old logging trail through the valley. They were young, college kids from Richmond, curious about ghost stories they'd found online. They didn't find the house. Not really. Only its outline, a foundation half buried in moss, a chimney leaning sideways like a monument to something better left forgotten. But near the creek, they found something else. A shallow bend in the water, lined with stones smoothed by time. The air was unnaturally still, the surface flat and glass-like even in the wind. And there, across the water, they saw three women, standing side by side, still as statues, their faces pale, hair drifting as though underwater, even though the air was still. One of the hikers called out, but the women didn't answer, didn't move. When the group blinked, just a breath, a heartbeat, the women were gone. They ran back to their car laughing nervously, trying to reason it away. But when they looked through the photos they'd taken, one frame caught their attention. It showed the creek, blurred and gray. And in the corner of the image, faint but unmistakable, was the reflection of three faces, staring back from the water. To this day, locals avoid Hollow Creek. The road leading in has no name now. The signs are rusted, the bridge half collapsed. But sometimes when the fog rolls low and the moon hangs white over the trees, travelers swear they hear singing from somewhere below. Three voices, soft, distant, perfectly in tune. And if you follow that sound to the water's edge, you might notice that the creek runs colder there, as though something beneath it still remembers. Because in Hollow Creek, Virginia, the ground remembers what people tried to forget. Decades passed and Hollow Creek faded almost entirely from memory. Its roads grew over, its houses collapsed, its stories whispered only in the corners of nearby towns. By 1937, the Great Depression had brought government work to Virginia, and with it the Works Progress Administration, men and women tasked with cataloging records, photographs, and county archives. Among them was Clara Whitmore, a young archivist with an eye for detail and a curiosity that often led her into long-forgotten corners of the courthouse. She was sorting old sheriff reports when she stumbled upon a file labeled simply "Missing Persons." Talbot, Hollow Creek. The folder was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay, the sort of smell that sticks to paper left untouched for decades. Clara opened it carefully. Inside were photographs of the graves, crudely labeled with the initials of the victims, the soil layers still faintly visible in sepia tones. There was also a signed affidavit by Sheriff Elias Granger. His handwriting was firm but tense. He recounted the dig, the bodies, the cellar jars, the burned ledger, and finally the disappearance of his deputies. At the bottom, in ink that had begun to fade, Granger had written something almost illegible. "The creek takes. The creek remembers." Finally, she reached the photograph of the Talbot sisters, the one found in the ritual room, water-stained and half-burned. She held it up to the light, careful not to damage it. The three sisters stared back, faces pale, eyes fixed forward, half in shadow as if they knew she was looking. Clara reached for the developing tray, curious to see if the image held anything hidden beneath the surface. When she processed the photograph fully, her breath caught. A fourth figure appeared behind the sisters, faint, blurred, almost transparent, but unmistakably present. It had no name, no reference in any of the accompanying notes. Its eyes seemed to pierce the photograph, catching the light differently from the others, almost watching Clara herself. She looked back at the affidavit, rereading Granger's note, and then she noticed the margins of the file. In handwriting different from Granger's, older, steadier, and in dark black ink, were the words, "Do not exhume the western field." The warning was clear. The western field, the one where the graves lay, where the sisters had disappeared, where the earth had resisted fire decades before, was a place not to disturb. Clara leaned back, heart pounding. The creek, the fog, the ritual, it all came together in a way that was no longer folklore. The Talbot sisters' story was written not in whispers anymore, but in ink, photographs, and first-hand testimony. She glanced around the archive room. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive in the corner. She could almost hear the faint humming that had been described, carried decades later through memory and fear. When she returned the file to its cabinet later that day, she found it gone. The archives claimed it had been misplaced. No explanation, no trail, no record of who had taken it. The photographs, the affidavit, the photograph with the fourth figure, all vanished. Yet the story had endured. The warnings, the horrors, the missing people, they had become the bones of a legend. And somewhere in the fog that still rolls through the old Hollow Creek Valley, the western field waits. Because some things, it seems, cannot be lost. Because some things cannot stay buried. By 1952, the memory of Hollow Creek had faded enough that newcomers thought it safe to return. A family, the Morrison family, purchased land near the ruins of the old Talbot farm. The house had collapsed decades ago. The field overgrown, the creek murmuring faintly like a story half remembered. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The children ran along the creek, the parents cleared brush, and for a time, the valley felt like it might breathe normally again. But it didn't take long for the hollow to remember. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the Morrisons' young daughter, Lillian, followed the sound of water to the creek's edge. Her parents called after her. She answered briefly, her voice light, then quieted. Then came the singing. 3 voices, clear and harmonic, drifting above the water, carrying the mist with them. The mother ran, heart pounding, to the creek. She found Lillian standing motionless on the bank, her gaze fixed across the water. When she reached for her, the girl stepped forward into the creek and vanished. Her footprints stopped at the water's edge. Panic-stricken, the Morrisons called the police. Investigators arrived the next morning and began to examine the old Talbot site. They uncovered remnants of the cellar, half buried under the collapsed foundation. The jars were still there, intact, dusted with decades of sediment. Each wax seal was unbroken. But when they opened one, just to inspect, the clear water inside seemed to shift, faintly alive, and floating within were eyes, not painted, not glass, not imitation. Real eyes drifting gently in the water, staring in all directions, as if observing the investigators. One officer gagged, dropping the jar. The sound echoed off the cellar walls. Another jar shattered in the spill, and the rest of the investigators froze. The sheriff ordered the site condemned. Everyone was evacuated. The valley was declared unsafe. Even the newspapers hesitated to print details, describing it vaguely as local superstition and possible chemical contamination. But the truth was far darker. Months later, a hunter passing through the overgrown road brought out an old camera. He'd been trying to capture the morning fog curling along the creek. When the film was developed, one frame sent a chill through anyone who saw it. 3 shapes, standing in the mist. Tall, slender, unmoving, dressed in the silhouettes of old-fashioned gowns. And their faces, though blurred by fog, seemed to stare directly into the camera and through it. The photograph was taken. It was never printed for public circulation, but copies whispered among local historians, collectors of strange folklore, and the descendants of those who had once lived in Hollow Creek. The valley was empty again. The Morrison family left within weeks. Their daughter was never seen. The creek continued to hum. The fog rolled in from the ridges, curling across the western field, hiding what remained beneath the earth. No one knew exactly where the Talbot sisters went. No one knew if they had died, or if they had simply crossed, leaving only shadows in the mist and jars of water filled with eyes that never blinked. And the creek remembers, always. It waits for those who dare to come too close, for the ones who hear singing in the fog, and for anyone who might stumble across the western field. Because some places, some people, and some stories never let go. Today, Hollow Creek is quiet. The road leading into the valley is overgrown, trees arching overhead until the sunlight struggles to reach the ground. The only sound is the creek, flowing relentlessly, carrying whispers that no one alive can fully understand. Locals who still live near the ridge tell the same thing, almost as a warning. A creek still listens. No one drinks from it. No one crosses the western field after sundown, and no one dares speak the Talbot sisters' names aloud. The graves remain, shallow depressions in the earth, marked by nothing more than mounds of moss and memory. No bodies were ever recovered, only the places where they were laid. Over the years, the forest has begun to reclaim the land, roots weaving through the soil where the missing once rested. Yet the story does not end with absence. In 1979, an archivist rediscovered a photograph, cracked along the edges, water-stained and yellowed with age. It was the same photograph found decades earlier in the Talbot house, the one removed from the WPA archives. The image was unchanged. The three women stood together, faces half lit, half in shadow, staring directly at the camera as if the lens itself were a mirror. Their expressions were unreadable, polite, calm, and yet impossibly still. Even the cracks in the photograph seemed to form around them, like the world itself was trying to separate us from looking too closely. For those who have seen it, the photograph is more than a picture. It is a warning, a reminder that some histories do not fade, that some lives, or unlives, endure in the fog, in the creek, in the land itself. The Talbot sisters were never caught. They were never explained. They became both memory and myth, a cautionary tale told in whispers and in fear. And yet, every once in a while, when the fog drifts low across the valley, when the water reflects the moon, just right, and when the wind, through the trees, carries a faint harmony, some say you can hear them again. Three voices, singing. As always, the creek listens. If you'd like more forgotten histories like this, make sure you're subscribed and tell me in the comments which Appalachian legend you want next. The wind moves through the trees, the water flows, and then silence.